The distress signal traveled through empty space at the speed of light and carried with it a message that would change everything for the peaceful colony on the Sara 9, and the diplomatic outpost was now under attack by forces that showed no mercy to anyone who stood in their way. An ambassador, Elena Rodriguez, knew that sending the emergency beacon was their only chance for survival, even though help seemed impossibly far away in the vast darkness of the galaxy. Lena had been a diplomat for 12 years, and she had spent most of that time negotiating trade agreements and hosting cultural exchanges between humanity and the dozens of alien species that populated the known galaxy, and she was good at her job because she understood that most conflicts could be resolved through patient conversation and mutual understanding. But today was different, and today there would be no negotiations. The Korthon Dominion had arrived without warning, and their ships had appeared in orbit above the colony just after dawn, and within minutes the bombardment had begun, and the peaceful mining settlement that housed 3,000 civilians from 6 different species was now burning, and the screams of the dying filled the air with a sound that Elena would never forget, no matter how long she lived. The ambassador Lyra of the Thesa stood beside Lena in the communications room, and her silver skin seemed to glow in the dim emergency lighting, and her violet eyes were wide with fear and confusion because her people had not experienced war in over 3,000 years, and they had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival against an enemy that wanted them dead. The Thesa were an ancient race, and they were tall and graceful with features that reminded humans of the elves from old Earth legends, and they had mastered interstellar travel when humanity was still learning to make fire, and their civilization was built on philosophy and art and the pursuit of knowledge, and they had no weapons and no armies and no understanding of why anyone would choose violence over peaceful coexistence. Lyra had been giving a lecture on Thesa poetry when the first explosion shook the building, and she had been in the middle of reciting a verse about the beauty of starlight on water when the windows exploded inward and shrapnel tore through the audience and killed 8 people before anyone could even scream. Lena had grabbed Lyra and pulled her down behind an overturned table, and the two of them had crawled through smoke and debris while Korthon soldiers moved through the building and shot anyone who moved in the dining hall that had been filled with laughter and conversation just minutes before. Was now a killing ground commander, Jessica Park, was already in the communications room when Elena and Lyra arrived, and she had blood running down the side of her face from a wound above her eye, but her hands were steady as she worked the controls of the long-range transmitter, and she looked up when they entered and nodded once Jessica had sent the distress beacon, and the message was simple and direct, and it contained their coordinates and a brief description of the attack and a request for immediate military assistance. And now all they could do was wait and hope that someone would come before the Korthons killed everyone in the colony. The problem was that the nearest human military base was 16 hours away at maximum faster than light speed, and the Korthons would have complete control of the colony long before any help could arrive. And Elena knew that their small security force of 20 guards could not hold out against an invasion force that numbered in the hundreds. Lyra was shaking, and her elegant robes were torn and stained with dust, and her voice trembled when she spoke, and she asked Elena how they could possibly survive until rescue arrived. And Elena looked at Jessica, and something passed between the two human women that Lyra did not understand. Jessica checked her weapon and made sure it was loaded, and she looked at Lyra with eyes that had gone cold and hard, and she asked the Thesa ambassador what she knew about Earth, and Lyra said that Earth, it was a garden world with pleasant weather and abundant resources, and that humans were known as traitors and diplomats who preferred peaceful solutions to conflicts. Elena shook her head and told Lyra that Earth was not a garden world, and that the pleasant appearance was deceiving, and that humanity had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them every single day, and that they had survived by becoming tougher and meaner and more stubborn than anything else that lived there. Jessica explained that humans were persistent hunters, and that their ancestors had chased prey animals across the African savanna for hours and hours until the prey collapsed from exhaustion and died, and that this ability to just keep going when everything else quit was built into their biology and their psychology. Lyra did not understand what hunting strategies had to do with their current situation, and she said that they were diplomats and scientists and not soldiers, and that they had no way to fight against trained Korthon warriors who had weapons and armor and tactical training. Elena pulled up a schematic of the compound on a computer terminal that was still working, and she studied the layout of the building, pointed to the maintenance tunnels that ran underneath the entire complex, and she told Jessica that they could use those tunnels to move through the compound without being seen by the Korthans. Jessica smiled, and it was not a friendly smile, and she said that the Korthans had made a mistake by attacking a human outpost because humans did not fight fair, and they did not follow the normal rules of warfare, and they would use every dirty trick and ambush tactic that they could think of. The maintenance tunnels beneath the diplomatic compound were dark and narrow, and the air smelled of oil and recycled atmosphere. And Alina led the way with a small emergency light, while Jessica followed behind with her weapon ready, and Lyra walked between them, trying not to think about the chaos and death happening above their heads. They had been moving through the tunnels for almost 20 minutes when they heard voices echoing from somewhere ahead, and Alina raised her hand to signal a stop, and they all froze and listened, and the voices were speaking in Korthon, and they were getting closer. Jessica motioned for Alina and Lyra to move back, and she positioned herself behind a junction of large pipes, where she would have cover and a clear line of sight. And Alina pulled Lyra into a side passage and put her hand over the Thessa woman's mouth to keep her quiet. 3 Korthon soldiers appeared around the corner, and they were moving cautiously with their weapons raised and scanning the tunnel ahead, and they were clearly searching for survivors who might have escaped into the maintenance system. And Jessica waited until they were past her position before she acted. The first Korthon died without making a sound, and Jessica had come up behind him and used a knife she had taken from the security office, and the blade went into the base of his skull and severed his spine, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Second, Korthon heard his companion fall and started to turn, but Jessica was already moving, and she grabbed his weapon and twisted it away from him, and then drove her elbow into his throat with enough force to crush his windpipe, and he fell choking and gasping. The third Korthon managed to raise his weapon and fire, but Jessica had already dropped low, and the energy bolt passed over her head and scorched the ceiling, and then she was on him. And they went down together in a tangle of limbs and thrashing violence. Lyra watched in horror as the human woman fought with a ferocity that seemed impossible for someone who had been serving tea and discussing trade policies just hours before. And Jessica moved with a speed and precision that spoke of training that went far beyond what any diplomat should possess. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds, and when it was over, all 3 Korthons were dead, and Jessica stood up and checked herself for injuries and found none. And then she began stripping the bodies of their weapons and equipment with an efficiency that suggested she had done this many times before. Lena emerged from the side passage with Lyra, and she immediately began helping Jessica gather the Korthon weapons and ammunition and body armor, and Lyra just stood there unable to process what she had just witnessed. Jessica looked at Lyra and saw the shock on her face, and she said that Lyra needed to understand something important about humans, and she said that every human child on Earth grew up learning about violence because their planet was filled with things that could kill them. Linnea added that Earth had venomous snakes and spiders and poisonous plants and predators that hunted humans for food, and diseases that killed millions, and natural disasters that destroyed entire cities, and humans had survived all of it by learning to be more dangerous than anything else on their world. Lyra said that the Thessa homeworld had nothing like that, and their evolution had been peaceful, and their planet had no large predators and no venomous creatures and very few diseases, and they had never needed to develop the capacity for violence that humans seemed to possess. Naturally, Jessica handed Alina one of the Korthon rifles and showed her how to operate it, and then she gave another one to Lyra and told her that she needed to learn how to use it because they might not always be there to protect her. Lyra held the weapon awkwardly, said that her people did not use such things, and that violence went against everything her civilization stood for, and Jessica said that her civilization was about to be extinct. They continued through the tunnels and collected more survivors along the way, and they found 2 human technicians hiding in a storage room, and 3 Thesa scientists who had barricaded themselves in a laboratory and one injured Nari diplomat, who had been shot in the leg. The group grew larger as they moved through the compound, and Lena organized them into something resembling a cohesive unit, and she assigned the humans to defensive positions and tried to teach the aliens basic survival skills. One of the human technicians was a woman named Amy, and she had worked in the compound's engineering section for 3 years, and she knew every pipe and conduit and access panel in the entire complex, and she told Alina that she could rig traps using the compound systems. Jessica liked this idea very much, and she asked Amy what kind of traps she could make, and Amy said that she could override safety systems and cause pressure buildups in certain pipes, and she could reroute electrical current to create deadly shocks in metal surfaces, and she could even collapse sections of corridor by weakening support structures, Lena told Amy. To do it, and to make the compound as dangerous as possible for the Korthons, and Amy grinned and said that she had always wanted to weaponize industrial systems, and now she finally had an excuse. They set up a temporary base in a large storage area that had only one entrance, and that entrance could be easily defended, and Jessica positioned guards at the doorway while Alina took stock of their supplies and weapons. Lyra sat in a corner with the other Thesa survivors, and they huddled together for comfort and spoke in quiet voices about the horror they had witnessed, and they could not understand why the Korthons wanted to kill them when they had done nothing wrong. One of the Thesa scientists was a young woman named Kira, and she had been studying human literature as part of a cultural exchange program, and she had read many human books about war and violence, and she had thought they were just fiction, and now she realized that humans wrote about violence because it was part of their nature. Captain Lisa Martinez stood on the bridge of the UHNS Valiant and watched the tactical display as her ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel and entered the Thesara 9 system, and behind her ship came another 40 vessels of the human war fleet, and they had made the journey in just under 16 hours, and they were ready for battle. Lisa had been sleeping when the distress signal arrived, and she had been awakened by her first officer, who told her that a human diplomatic outpost was under attack, and that there were multiple casualties, and that immediate military response was requested. She had been out of bed and dressed in her uniform within 2 minutes, and on the bridge within 5, and she had ordered the fleet to prepare for immediate departure, and to load all weapons, and to expect heavy combat upon arrival. The journey had seemed to take forever, even though they had traveled faster than light, and Lisa had spent the time reviewing intelligence reports about the Korthon Dominion and planning attack strategies, and trying not to think about the people who were dying while she raced to reach them. The Korthon Dominion was a mid-level power in the galaxy, and they controlled about 30 star systems and had a military force that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and they were known for being aggressive and expansionist, and they had been involved in several border disputes with their neighbors. What they were not known for was attacking diplomatic missions in civilian colonies, and this was a violation of so many interstellar treaties that Lisa could not even count them all, and the Korthons must have been desperate or stupid or both to do something this provocative. The tactical officer reported that there were 12 Korthon warships in orbit around the Sarah 9, and that they had ground forces deployed on the surface around the diplomatic compound, and that they were jamming all communications from the planet. Lisa ordered the weapons officer to target the Korthon ships and to fire on her command, and she opened a communication channel to the Korthon fleet commander and gave him one chance to surrender before she destroyed his entire force. The Korthon commander was a warrior named Thrak, and he appeared on the view screen with his mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement, and he said that the humans were too late, and that the colony was already his, and that Lisa should withdraw before she started a war that humanity could not win. Lisa looked at him with cold fury, and she said that he had exactly 30 seconds to begin withdrawing his forces, or she would demonstrate exactly what a war with humanity looked like, and Thrak laughed and closed the communication channel. Lisa gave the order to fire, and the human fleet opened up with everything they had, and the Korthon ships were caught completely off guard because they had not expected the humans to actually attack. And they had thought that humans were soft and diplomatic and preferred negotiations over violence. First salvo of missiles and energy weapons struck the Korthon flagship and tore through its shields. Like they were not even there, and the ship broke apart in a series of explosions that lit up the space around the planet, and debris rained down into the atmosphere. The other Korthon ships tried to return fire, but they were hopelessly outmatched, and the human fleet had been designed for one purpose, and that purpose was to win wars against any enemy, no matter how powerful they thought they were. Lisa watched as her ships systematically destroyed the Korthon fleet, and she felt no satisfaction in the slaughter, because these ships had been bombing civilians and murdering diplomats, and they deserved everything they got. Within 15 minutes, all 12 Korthon warships were either destroyed or drifting helplessly in space, with their reactors offline and their crews dead or dying. And Lisa ordered her ships to begin orbital bombardment of the Korthon ground forces. The targeting officer identified the locations of Korthon troop concentrations around the diplomatic compound, and Lisa approved the strike coordinates and made sure that the bombardment would avoid hitting the compound itself or any civilian structures. Bombardment was precise and devastating, in Korthon positions evaporated under coordinated strikes from orbit and soldiers who had been confidently attacking. Defenseless diplomats suddenly found themselves being vaporized by weapons they had no defense against. Down on the surface, Alina heard the explosions and felt the ground shake, and she knew that the human fleet had arrived. And she told everyone to take cover because the bombardment was going to be intense. Lyra could not believe what she was hearing, and she said that orbital bombardment was forbidden by every civilized species in the galaxy, and that it caused too much collateral damage and risked killing civilians along with military targets. Lena said that human weapons were precise enough to avoid civilian casualties, and that the Korthons were about to learn that attacking humans was a very bad idea. And Lyra realized that she had been completely wrong about what humans were capable of. The bombardment lasted for 20 minutes, and when it stopped, there was nothing left of the Korthon ground forces except craters and scattered debris, and the few survivors who had not been directly hit were fleeing in panic. Jessica led a team out of the compound too, secured the perimeter, and they found Korthon soldiers stumbling through the ruins with their weapons abandoned and their armor scorched and their eyes wide. With shock, one Korthon soldier fell to his knees when he saw Jessica approaching, and he begged for mercy in broken galactic common, and Jessica looked at him with contempt and said that he should have thought about mercy before he started killing diplomats. She did not shoot him, but she did take him prisoner along with the other survivors. And by the time the human Marines landed from orbit, there was very little left for them to do except secure the area and begin processing prisoners. Lisa came down to the surface personally, and she wanted to see the damage and assess the situation and meet with the survivors who had held out until rescue arrived. She found Alina in what was left of the diplomatic compound, and the two women embraced briefly, and Lisa asked how many survivors they had, and Alina said that out of 3,000 civilians in the colony, about 2,000 had survived, and most of the casualties had occurred in the first hour of the attack. Lisa said that was better than she had feared, and Alina said that was because they had fought back and made the Korthons pay for every meter of ground they took. Ambassador Lyra stood among the ruins of the diplomatic compound and watched human soldiers moving through the wreckage with practiced efficiency, and they were helping injured civilians and setting up medical stations and securing weapons and treating everyone with a professionalism that seemed at odds with the violence they had just unleashed. She saw Captain Lisa Martinez speaking with Alina and Jessica, and the three human women looked tired but satisfied. And they were reviewing reports on a portable computer and making plans for the next steps. Lisa noticed Lyra watching them, and she walked over and introduced herself and asked if Lyra was injured, and Lyra said that she was physically unharmed, but that she was not sure she would ever recover from what she had witnessed. Lisa nodded and said that war was traumatic for everyone involved, and that the Thesa were fortunate that they had never had to experience it before, and that hopefully this attack would be the last violence they would ever see. Lyra asked Lisa how humans could be so good at violence when they also claimed to value peace and diplomacy. And Lisa said that the two things were not mutually exclusive, and that humans preferred peace, but were prepared for war. She explained that Earth had taught humanity that the universe was dangerous, and that survival required strength, and that those who could not defend themselves would be at the mercy of those who had no mercy. To give Lyra said that the Thessa had believed that civilization meant moving beyond violence, and that advanced species did not need weapons or armies, and that conflicts could always be resolved through discussion and compromise. Lisa said that was a beautiful ideal, but that it only worked if everyone agreed to follow the same rules, and that the Korthon Dominion had just proven that not everyone in the galaxy was civilized. The Korthon commander Thrak was brought before Lisa in restraints, and he had been captured from the bridge of his flagship before it exploded, and he was injured and angry and refused to show any remorse for what he had done. Lisa looked at him with disgust and said that he had violated every treaty and law that governed interstellar relations, and that he had murdered civilians and attacked diplomats under protection, and that his actions would have severe consequences for his entire species. Thrak said that the Korthons were strong and that the weak deserved to be conquered, and that the Thessa had valuable mining rights that his people needed, and that taking them by force was simply the natural order of things. Lisa said that the natural order was about to change because humanity was not going to tolerate attacks on peaceful species, and that the Korthon Dominion would pay reparations and surrender territory and accept monitoring of their military or face total destruction. Thrak laughed and said that humanity was just one species among thousands, and that they did not have the power to enforce such demands, and that the people Korthons would recover from this defeat and strike back when the time was right. Lisa smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile, and she said that Thrak was welcome to try, and that humanity would be waiting, and that next time they would not stop at destroying a single fleet. She ordered him taken away to be held for trial, and then she returned to the task of organizing the relief effort and helping the survivors begin rebuilding their lives over the next several days. Human ships brought supplies and medical personnel and construction equipment, and they worked alongside the Thessa and the other species who had lived in the colony to repair the damage and restore essential services. Lyra spent much of her time with Lena and Jessica, and she asked them questions about human history and culture, and tried to understand how a species could be both gentle and brutal, and both diplomatic and warlike. Atola about the history of Earth and the countless wars that humans had fought against each other, and the weapons they had developed, and the millions who had died before humanity finally learned to work together. She said that humans had been on the brink of destroying themselves several times, and that they had come close to nuclear war and ecological collapse, and that only the threat of extinction had forced them to cooperate. Jessica added that violence was not something humans were proud of, but it was part of who they were, and that denying it, or pretending it did not exist, would not make them safer. She said that humans had learned to channel their aggressive instincts into productive purposes, and that the same drive that made them dangerous to their enemies also made them loyal to their friends and fierce protectors of those they cared about. Lyra began to understand that humans were more complex than she had realized, and that they could not be easily categorized as either peaceful or violent, because they were both, and the key was knowing when to be which one. Evening, Lyra sat with Alina on what was left of the compound's observation deck and watched the sun set over the damaged colony, and she said that she was grateful for what the humans had done, but that she was also frightened of them. Alina said that was a reasonable response, and that humans could be frightening when they needed to be, and that the galaxy was starting to understand that attacking human interests or human allies was a very bad ideal. Lyra asked if humans would always respond with such overwhelming force when they were threatened, and Alina said that it depended on the situation, but that, yes, humanity had made a decision to be strong enough that no one would dare attack them. She said that humans had watched too many species fall to aggression and conquest, and that they had decided to be the ones who protected the weak and punished the aggressors, and that this role came with responsibilities and costs. Lyra said that the Thessa would need time to process what had happened and to decide how they felt about humanity and their methods. And Alina said that was fine, and that humans understood that not everyone would approve of how they did things. 3 weeks after the attack, the Korthon Dominion formally apologized to the Galactic Council and agreed to pay reparations to the victims of their aggression, and they surrendered control of 3 border systems and accepted human monitoring of their military forces for the next 10 years. The apology came after intensive negotiations and after humanity made it very clear that they were prepared to continue the war if necessary, and that the next phase would involve attacks on core worlds and strategic facilities. Other species in the galaxy watched these developments with great interest, and many of them began to reconsider their assumptions about humanity and about what it meant to be a diplomatic species in a dangerous universe. The Thesa Council invited Captain Lisa Martinez to their homeworld to discuss mutual defense, and they wanted to learn from humanity about how to protect themselves without abandoning their principles of peace and cooperation. Lisa accepted the invitation, and she traveled to the Thesa homeworld with a delegation of military advisors and diplomats, and she spent several days meeting with Thesa leaders and explaining human strategic thinking. Thesa were reluctant to build weapons or train soldiers, but they understood that they needed some way to defend themselves, and they asked if humans would be willing to provide protection in exchange for resources and technology. Lisa said that humanity would be honored to serve as protectors for the Thesa, but that the arrangement needed to be fair and mutual, and that the Thesa should not simply become dependent on human military power. She suggested that the Thesa could contribute to their own defense in other ways, and that their advanced technology and scientific knowledge could be used to develop defensive systems and early warning networks. The Thesa agreed to this approach, and over the following months they worked with human engineers to create a defense network that did not require the Thesa to become warriors, but that gave them the ability to detect threats and call for help. Ambassador Lyra returned to the Sara 9 once the colony was rebuilt, and she resumed her diplomatic duties, but she was a changed person, and she had seen things that she could never unsee and learned things that she could never forget. She maintained a close friendship with Alina and Jessica, and the 3 women often met to discuss philosophy and politics and the nature of civilization and violence, and they found that they had much to learn from each other. Lyra wrote a book about her experiences during the attack, and it became required reading for Thesa diplomats and students, and it sparked a debate in Thesa society about whether their commitment to absolute pacifism was realistic in a galaxy that contained species like the Corthantsum. Thesa argued that they should remain true to their principles no matter the cost, and others said that survival had to take priority over idealism. And the debate continued for years. Alina was promoted and given command of a new diplomatic initiative focused on building alliances between humanity and peaceful species who needed protection, and she traveled throughout the galaxy and negotiated defense agreements and mutual aid pacts. Jessica retired from active duty and took a position training security personnel for diplomatic missions, and she made sure that every human diplomat knew how to fight and survive if things went wrong. The attack on the Sara 9 became a turning point in galactic politics, and it established humanity as a major military power and as a species that would respond with overwhelming force when threatened or when their allies were threatened. Other aggressive species began to think twice before starting conflicts, and several border disputes were resolved peacefully when humanity made it clear that they were watching and that they would intervene if necessary. The Corthon Dominion never recovered from the humiliation of their defeat, and they retreated into isolation and focused on rebuilding their military and nursing their grudges and planning for a future confrontation that would never come. Years later, Lyra visited Earth for the first time, and Alina gave her a tour of human historical sites and showed her the museums dedicated to human wars and the monuments to those who had died in conflicts throughout history. Lyra stood before a memorial to soldiers who had died defending others, and she finally understood what humans meant when they said that the capacity for violence was sometimes necessary to protect peace. She said that the Thesa would never be warriors, like humans, but that they had learned to appreciate those who were willing to fight on their behalf, and that they would honor that sacrifice. Lena said that was all humans asked, and that they did not expect other species to become like them, but only to understand why humanity did what it did.